It started as just another episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. Microphones, caffeine, and that sharp, unfiltered honesty Joe's known for. But this time, something was different. Somewhere between the jokes and the debate, Joe let something slip. Something about Erika Kirk. A private conversation. A secret meant only for Charlie's parents. And the internet? It erupted. People started asking, why would Joe even know that? How did that conversation get to him? And most importantly, was any of it true? Because when Joe Rogan exposes something, it's never small. It's raw. It's viral. It's unstoppable. And what Erika allegedly said that night could change everything the public thought they knew about the Kirk family. This is the story of truth, trust, and the moment Joe Rogan crossed a line that no one saw coming. Joe Rogan has spent more than a decade building a kingdom from behind a microphone. A place where truth meets controversy, where laughter melts into confrontation, and where every guest eventually says more than they intended. For millions, the Joe Rogan Experience isn't just a podcast, it's a modern-day arena. And in that arena, the rules are simple. Once the mic is on, nothing stays secret for long. That's what made the night of episode 2137 so unforgettable. The cameras rolled, the red on-air light flickered to life, and Joe leaned forward with that familiar grin, half comedian, half interrogator. The guest list that night didn't include any Kirks, but the conversation somehow circled straight into their living room. It started innocently, a discussion about public figures who preach one thing and live another. Joe chuckled, shook his head, and said, almost as if speaking from experience, "Man, you'd be surprised what some of these so-called faith influencers say when the cameras aren't rolling. Like, the kind of stuff they tell their in-laws when it gets too heavy." He laughed afterward, a throwaway comment. But the internet doesn't do throwaways. Within hours, the clip exploded across Reddit and X, comment sections filled with questions. Was he talking about Charlie Kirk's wife, Erika? How would Joe even know that? Did he just leak something private? The reason it hit so hard was timing. Just a week earlier, rumors had begun circulating that the Kirks were facing tension at home. A Christian values power couple, constantly touring, constantly posting, and constantly held up as examples of moral perfection, the cracks were beginning to show. Inside their tight-knit circle, whispers claimed that Erika had recently broken down during a family gathering at Charlie's parents' house in Phoenix. The story went that she'd confessed feeling trapped by the image they'd built together. "It's not that I don't love him," she supposedly said. "I just don't love who we have to pretend to be." Those words were never meant for an audience, and yet somehow, they traveled. Somewhere along that chain of whispers, it seems they reached the world's most listened-to podcaster. When Rogan made his offhand comment, listeners pieced it together instantly. The subtext matched the rumors word for word. Whether intentional or not, Joe had confirmed what everyone suspected. There was trouble inside America's most public Christian marriage. By the next morning, the hashtag #JoeRoganExposes Erika was trending. Memes flooded TikTok. Conservative commentators scrambled to defend the Kirks, while progressive channels treated the leak as proof of hypocrisy. Erika, known for her quiet grace and minimal public statements, vanished from social media. Her last post, a soft-lit quote about truth setting you free, was suddenly getting dissected like evidence in a trial. And Charlie? He didn't rant, didn't post videos. He simply tweeted 8 words that cut through the noise. The enemy always was a friendly smile. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. Behind the headlines, the story grew darker. A former production assistant from a Turning Point event told an independent journalist that Joe had once been approached by someone close to the Kirks who wanted him to understand the real side of Erika, that she wasn't the perfect poster wife. Whether Joe believed it or not, he had mentioned the conversation on air, unaware of the wildfire it would ignite. For Joe's fans, this was classic Rogan, the uncensored truth-teller poking at hypocrisy. But for Erika's supporters, it felt like betrayal. They asked, since when does a conversation between a wife and her in-laws become podcast material? Journalists began digging. Old interviews resurfaced where Erika had talked about the pressure to represent Christian womanhood. Viewers replayed those clips in slow motion, searching for pain in her eyes. A YouTube commentator said it best. "It's not about whether Joe told the truth. It's about whether the truth was his to tell." The fallout reached a fever pitch when TMZ caught Joe outside his Austin studio. A reporter shouted, "Did you mean Erika Kirk?" Joe smiled but didn't answer. He just said, "I talk about human nature, not gossip," and walked away. To his audience, that sounded like deflection. To critics, It sounded like confirmation. Inside the Kirk household, silence wasn't peace. Friends described Charlie as laser-focused but distant, burying himself in work while Erika stayed with her parents for several weeks. Church appearances were quietly cancelled. Donations to their ministry dipped for the first time in 2 years. Meanwhile, every reaction video, every podcast breakdown, every tweet kept repeating Joe's line, "You'd be surprised what they tell their in-laws." It became a cultural echo, a meme, a punchline, and a dagger all at once. The real tragedy? What Erika allegedly said wasn't scandalous. It was human. She was tired, exhausted by being perfect. She wanted space to breathe, to not always represent an idea larger than herself. But once those words were repeated by someone with a global platform, context vanished. Vulnerability turned into ammunition. That's the thing about exposure. It doesn't matter if the secret is small. Once it's public, it's poison. In one of the quieter corners of Reddit, a user claiming to be close to the family wrote, "If Joe knew the full story, he'd regret saying it. Erika was just asking for empathy." No one could verify it, but the sentiment struck a chord. The narrative began to shift, from mockery to melancholy, from scandal to sadness. Commenters who had once laughed started wondering if maybe this was less about hypocrisy and more about how easily private pain becomes public entertainment. As week 1 ended, Joe's episode continued to climb views. YouTube recommended it on millions of homepages. Each new viewer fed the algorithm. Each replay magnified the echo. For Joe, it was another viral week. For the Kirks, it was the unraveling of a brand built on certainty. Somewhere between truth and exploitation, a line had been crossed, and no one could quite agree on who crossed it first. That's where our story begins. With one offhand comment, one unguarded sentence, Joe Rogan had done what he always does, ignite a conversation the world wasn't ready to have. But as the dust settled, one question lingered louder than the clip itself. Was it truth, or was it a lie too big for even Joe Rogan to control? Silence can be louder than words. And for days, that silence from both Joe Rogan and the Kirk family was deafening. But in today's world, silence isn't seen as grace. It's seen as guilt. By the end of the week, YouTube analysts, political commentators, and drama channels were dissecting every frame of Joe's podcast. He smirked when he said it. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a slip, it was a statement. Across social media, hashtags took sides, #TeamJoe versus #ProtectErika. One side claimed Rogan was exposing hypocrisy, that he was shining a light on influencers who built brands on perfection while hiding chaos behind the scenes. The other side saw a woman being humiliated for confiding her feelings in private. The truth? It lay buried under thousands of retweets and reaction videos. In Austin, Rogan's studio buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Clips from the episode were being remixed into TikToks, and his producers couldn't stop the flood. They suggested he make a clarification on air, maybe even deny the connection. But Joe refused. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I don't walk things back. People hear what they want." For Rogan, that was final. But for Erika Kirk, it was the start of a public unraveling. Reporters began camping outside her speaking events. Christian blogs speculated on her marriage. Tabloids printed grainy photos of her leaving a cafe with her sister and spun them into headlines like Erika seen in tears after Joe's shocking revelation. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the Kirks' family dinners turned tense. Charlie's parents, the very people Erika had once confided in, now found themselves at the center of a national spectacle. Friends close to the family said they were devastated. What was meant to be a moment of vulnerability had become a public battlefield. One of Charlie's old college friends later told The Insider, "It wasn't the words that hurt. It was how easily they were used against them." Erika trusted her family. But now, it feels like even the walls have microphones. That phrase, "even the walls have microphones," caught on fast. It became the unofficial tagline of the scandal. Podcasters repeated it. Memes used it. It perfectly captured the world's paranoia about privacy, fame, and how quickly trust could be turned into trending content. And ironically, Joe Rogan's critics used that line against him. Because who had the biggest microphone of them all? Joe himself. Soon, pressure began mounting from his own audience. Viewers who once celebrated Rogan's authenticity began to question his ethics. Was this really about truth? Or was it about clicks? An unexpected voice entered the conversation. Lex Friedman, Joe's longtime friend and fellow podcaster. In one of his episodes, Lex gently commented, There's a fine line between revealing truth and stealing peace. Sometimes, the cost isn't worth the clip. It wasn't a direct call-out, but everyone understood who he meant. The internet thrives on drama, and this comment poured gasoline on the fire. Meanwhile, Erika broke her silence. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she posted a single statement on her Instagram story. White background, black text, no music. Words can be twisted. Hearts can be broken. But faith is not built on fear. I forgive, but I won't forget who benefited from my pain. It disappeared after 24 hours, but screenshots spread like wildfire. Commenters flooded in. She's talking about Joe. She knows it's true, but she's not denying it. Forgiveness or shade? The ambiguity only deepened the fascination. 2 days later, Rogan finally addressed it, indirectly. On his podcast, with comedian Tim Dillon, he laughed about how the internet loves to play connect the dots. He said, "Man, I could say someone once told their dog a secret, and the internet would have that dog trending." It was funny, and painful. Because in that joke, he was denying responsibility, but not the damage. Tim laughed, but then asked, half seriously, "But you do know who they thought you meant, right?" Rogan paused, leaned back, and said nothing. The silence said everything. In media circles, that moment became the new centerpiece of analysis. People slowed down the footage, watching Rogan's eyes dart to the side. Psychology experts on TikTok claimed his micro-expressions showed guilt. It became less about truth, and more about performance. Even the Daily Beast wrote a feature titled, "When the King of Podcasts Becomes the Story." Because for the first time, Joe wasn't just the host, he was the headline. Meanwhile, Erika's world kept shrinking. Speaking engagements were cancelled due to security concerns. Church leaders urged her to pray for discernment, not retribution. But behind closed doors, she was reportedly heartbroken. According to a close friend who later spoke off record, she didn't care about the gossip. She cared that Joe was someone she and Charlie once admired. They listened to his podcast together. To have him expose something so personal felt like betrayal from a mentor. And yet, Erika stayed silent. Her silence, in a strange way, became her armor. But the silence didn't last long. Because 1 week later, another piece of the puzzle surfaced, a leaked text thread allegedly between an anonymous producer and a friend of Joe's. The messages read, "He knew it was Erika. He said it off record before the show." Screenshots circulated online, and suddenly, the scandal reignited. Now, it wasn't just about what Erika said to Charlie's parents. It was about whether Joe Rogan had deliberately planned to expose it. News anchors debated it. YouTubers dramatized it. And Joe? He still refused to issue a statement. For years, his strength had been his independence, his refusal to answer to the mob. But this time, that independence came off as arrogance. His silence didn't calm the storm. It fed it. Within 2 weeks, the narrative flipped. Rogan wasn't seen as the truth teller anymore. He was the man who went too far. In an emotional twist, one small clip from Erika's old interview resurfaced, recorded years before this scandal, long before any of the noise. In it, she said, "The hardest part of faith in public life is that your mistakes become everyone's entertainment. And your pain becomes their proof." That clip began trending under #LetErikaHeal. It marked the first time since the controversy began that public sympathy started turning toward her. Even Joe's fans started admitting, maybe, just maybe, this time he'd crossed a line. But if Joe Rogan had truly exposed Erika, then who exposed Joe? Because as we're about to see, Part 3 reveals something no one expected, a secret that flips the story entirely. The internet thought it had the full story. Joe Rogan exposed Erika Kirk, the Kirks went silent, and a marriage built on faith was cracking under pressure. But like every viral storm, there was a shadow underneath the headlines. And the truth, when it finally surfaced, wasn't what anyone expected. By mid-month, whispers about a leaked producer chat began spreading through small online forums, screenshots of internal messages from Rogan's production team. At first, they looked fake, blurry, misspelled, too convenient. But then one of Joe's former assistant editors, who had quietly left the team months earlier, confirmed their authenticity in a late-night Reddit AMA. "He didn't mean to leak anything," the editor wrote. "It was bait. Someone told Joe that Erika had said something huge about Charlie's family, and he brought it up on air to see who would react." The revelation flipped everything upside down. Joe wasn't the one spreading a secret. He was testing who inside his own circle had leaked to him. According to that same editor, Rogan had heard the original story weeks before from a trusted friend, a mutual acquaintance in the conservative influencer world who had claimed to overhear Erika's private conversation with Charlie's parents. But something didn't add up. The story kept changing. Details shifted depending on who told it. So Joe did what Joe does best. He experimented live. That one line on the podcast, "You'd be surprised what some people say to their in-laws," wasn't an expose. It was bait. A way to flush out whoever was feeding false intel to his network. The problem? The internet doesn't do nuance. By the time his plan started working, the damage to Erika's reputation was already irreversible. Inside the Rogan studio, the mood shifted from excitement to dread. Producers started panicking as online outrage mounted. One of them, identified only as Dave in leaked emails, warned Joe. "They think it's about Erika. You've got to clarify before this gets ugly." Joe reportedly replied, "If I explain it, I validate it. Let them believe what they want. The truth will surface." But the truth didn't surface. Not yet. And in that silence, everyone began building their own version of events. Meanwhile, inside the Kirk family home, things grew tense. Charlie's father, a soft-spoken retired pastor, released a rare statement to a small Arizona paper. "We know who we are. We know what was said and what wasn't. The truth may take time, but it always arrives." Those words seemed calm, almost peaceful. But privately, sources said the statement was a coded message aimed directly at Rogan. Because according to people close to the family, the Kirks had finally learned the real origin of the rumor. It hadn't come from Joe at all. It had started with a family friend, someone who had been at that dinner where Erika spoke openly. That friend had twisted her words, then passed the story along, adding spice to impress others in their circle. It was that version, exaggerated and half-false, that eventually made its way to Rogan through a chain of mutual acquaintances. In other words, Joe had repeated a distortion of a distortion, and the internet treated it like gospel. Days later, Vanity Fair published an investigative piece titled "Faith, Fame, and the Leak That Shook the Podcast World." It meticulously reconstructed the timeline, confirming what insiders had suspected. Joe had never spoken directly to anyone in the Kirk family. His information came secondhand, and deliberately manipulated by someone seeking attention. The article even claimed that the original source had since deleted their social media accounts after being identified by fans. When Rogan's team was contacted for comment, they refused. But the story included a small, haunting detail. One of Rogan's producers reportedly whispered before hanging up. Joe wanted to expose a liar, and ended up becoming one. The emotional fallout hit both camps hard. For Erika, the damage was already done. She couldn't undo the humiliation of having her private words twisted and broadcast to millions. But instead of retreating, she began to reclaim her story. A week later, she posted a 10-minute video titled "When They Tell Your Story for You." In it, she sat alone, no makeup, a plain backdrop, her voice trembling yet steady. "I've been quiet because I wanted peace," she began. "But silence can make lies grow louder. I said things in a moment of pain. I said I was tired. I said I was struggling. But I never said I wanted to leave my husband. I never said I was done with faith." Those words were stolen, twisted, and used as entertainment. Her tone was heartbreakingly human. No anger, no bitterness, just sadness. "I forgive Joe," she added softly. "But I hope he understands that truth isn't a game. People's lives are not your experiments." Within hours, the video surpassed 1 million views. The comment section was flooded with support, even from unexpected places. Influencers, pastors, and journalists publicly apologized for jumping to conclusions. And for the first time since the saga began, the narrative shifted. But the internet being the internet, the twist wasn't done. The next morning, a clip surfaced, a leaked behind-the-scenes video from Rogan's studio, allegedly recorded the night after Erika's upload. In it, Joe could be heard talking to his crew. "Yeah, I saw the video," he said. "She's right. I screwed up the delivery. I was trying to expose the setup, not the person. But when you throw gasoline into the wind, it lands where it wants." That clip went viral instantly. And suddenly, the man who had built a brand on never apologizing seemed remorseful. Fans were stunned. Commentators replayed the line, "gasoline into the wind," as if decoding a confession. Joe hadn't issued a public apology yet, but that quiet acknowledgement spoke louder than any press release could. By the end of that week, a strange sense of balance began to return. The outrage cooled. The memes faded. But the question that started it all still lingered. Was Erika lying when she spoke to Charlie's parents? Or was Joe's version the real lie? In truth, neither mattered anymore. What mattered was what the entire world had learned from it, that in the age of microphones and headlines, even a whisper can become a war. As one journalist summed it up, this wasn't a scandal about truth. It was a scandal about who gets to tell it first. For Joe, it was a rare loss, a bruise on an otherwise unshakable legacy. For Erika, it was painful redemption. Her silence had been weaponized, but her voice reclaimed it. And for the world watching, it was a reminder that when fame meets faith and microphones meet secrets, no one walks away clean. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was deafening. For weeks, Joe Rogan said nothing. No podcast monologue. No Instagram statement. Just an eerie quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk's emotional video continued to trend. It wasn't scandalous, it wasn't dramatic, it was real. And somehow, that hit harder than anything Joe could have said behind a mic. Microphone # the return episode. Then, one night, without warning, a new episode dropped on Spotify. #2319, Joe Rogan, clearing the air. The thumbnail showed Joe alone. No guest, no smile, no whiskey glass. Just him and a mic. Within minutes, it exploded online. Fans rushed in expecting anger, excuses, or at least the old Rogan bravado. But what they got was something else entirely. Joe began quietly. You know, sometimes you think you're in control of the story. You think you're the one asking questions, running the experiment. But this time, I was the experiment. The tone was raw, reflective, even broken. He went on to explain how the Erika Kirk story wasn't meant to be gossip or exposure, but a test for his own team. He had been told that Erika made shocking statements about Charlie's family, and he wanted to see which of his inner circle would leak it once he hinted on air. I thought I was being clever, he admitted. Turns out, I was careless. For the next hour, Joe talked. No interruptions, no edits. He described the telephone game of misinformation that spiraled out of control. I said one vague sentence, and suddenly, she's trending, her family's hurting, and people are calling me a snake. I didn't leak a lie. But I also didn't stop one. He paused for a moment, letting that land. When you've got a platform this big, intent doesn't matter. Impact does. Those words hit hard, especially for longtime Rogan fans who admired his refusal to bow to media pressure. But this wasn't bowing. It was owning. Explosion symbol behind closed doors. After the podcast aired, multiple insiders revealed what had been happening behind the scenes during Joe's silence. Spotify's legal team had reportedly urged him to stay quiet until their own internal review was complete. There were concerns about defamation, contract clauses, and the platform's public image. According to one executive source, they didn't want him to speak until they confirmed no intentional harm was done. When the truth came out, Joe insisted on speaking his way, no script, no PR filter. That decision paid off. Within 24 hours, hashtags like #JoeSpeaksTruth and #ErikaDeservedBetter were trending side by side. For the first time, both sides found common ground. That everyone involved had been played by the machine of viral outrage. Person with praying hands. Erika's response. The next morning, Erika Kirk uploaded a response video titled Forgiven. It opened with a verse from Proverbs. Whoever conceals hatred with lying lips and spreads slander is a fool. Then she smiled faintly, not bitterly, but peacefully. Joe apologized. And for that, I'm thankful. But this was never about him versus me. It's about all of us, the way we treat words, the way we twist pain into content. She ended with a quiet, powerful line. The internet doesn't forget, but it can forgive. The clip ended, fade to black. That single sentence would later be quoted in dozens of articles, podcasts, and think pieces. Scales # the fallout. By then, both camps had taken a hit. Rogan's credibility had been bruised, but not broken. He'd done what few in his position ever do, take responsibility publicly. Spotify renewed its confidence in his show but enforced new internal checks for ethical content protocol. As for Erika and Charlie Kirk, they emerged more united than before. Their followers rallied. their family events became symbols of transparency and grace, and Erika's quiet strength turned her into an unexpected voice for digital empathy. In an ironic twist, the controversy that almost destroyed them became the reason millions discovered who they really were. Performing Arts: The Real Story. Months later, a media documentary titled Echoes of a Lie, the Rogan-Kirk fallout, aired on Netflix. It broke down the entire saga in forensic detail, how one whispered rumor became a global headline through podcasts, social media algorithms, and human curiosity. The documentary revealed something few people knew. The original source, the person who twisted Erika's private words, had since apologized privately to both sides. But the internet never found out who it was, because both Joe and Erika agreed to keep that person's name secret. "We don't need another villain," Joe said. "We need closure." And that was the final, defining moment of maturity for both of them. Speech balloon legacy of the lie. Today, the Erika Kirk leak stands as one of the most analyzed viral moments in modern podcast culture, a cautionary tale about influence, responsibility, and truth. Media professors cite it as a prime example of narrative distortion, how easily a story can mutate when filtered through fame, emotion, and echo chambers. Even Joe himself referenced it months later on an unrelated episode. "I learned the hard way that curiosity without context is a weapon, and sometimes you point it at the wrong person." That line became iconic, clipped, shared, quoted endlessly online. Fire the final reflection. In the end, this wasn't about Joe Rogan versus Erika Kirk. It was about the thin line between truth and entertainment, and how, in the age of instant outrage, that line barely exists anymore. Every click, every post, every "did you hear what she said?" becomes a ripple that can sink someone's peace. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment everyone realized how fragile that balance really is. One sentence started it, the narrator says, but honesty ended it. The camera fades out on Rogan's studio light, the same one that once illuminated gossip, now dimmed in quiet self-awareness. And as the dust settles, one question still lingers: what really happened behind the scenes before Joe's apology aired? Because insiders claim there's one piece of the story we haven't seen: a deleted recording, pulled hours before upload, allegedly containing Joe saying, "You'd be shocked if you knew who told me first." Who was he talking about? A producer? A friend? Or someone inside the Kirk family itself? Maybe this wasn't just a misunderstanding, maybe it was a setup. One rumor, one microphone, one truth still waiting to surface. Because in Joe Rogan's world, silence doesn't mean peace, it means the next revelation is already loading. So before you scroll, remember, the biggest secret isn't what he said. It's who wanted it heard. White right pointing backhand index, stay tuned, because what comes next will change everything.